Okay, so a lot of melodrama going on YouTube these days. There's, I guess, internal fractures in the theist atheist groups, respectively. Lots of melodrama going on over the red button question and the anti-natalist, natalist haggles. Some of this Thunderfoot, PZ Myers stuff. There's just so much that's going on that I guess, part of the question is, to what extent is YouTube itself a kind of consciousness? Is it a collective consciousness? Is there something more than individuals uploading content? Is there a kind of consciousness being created electronically through the connections, through the dialogue? And then I think if one admits that there might be, or that there's something like the emergence of a new form or shape of consciousness that's being managed electronically here on the web, on the net, I think the question then becomes, is there an unconscious, and can it be subject to various forms of psychoanalysis? Paul Ricoeur, when he identified, I guess it was Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud as the master hermeneuticists of suspicion. And his point was that all three of them did a kind of debunking where they unmasked motives that were hidden from the people who thought that they were understanding themselves quite clearly. And if you go to Freud, Freud's most classic is psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis, the patient comes in and Freud says, lay down on the couch and, tell me about this, that, and the other thing. And the motives that the person gives get interpreted through Freud's theory, and he says, oh no, the truth is you want to have sex with one parent and kill the other, and it's not at all that you want to win in the tennis match coming up, or, whatever. It's a sort of silly reinterpreting of what people are doing through these depth motives. And I think we can say it's silly and we can be critical of it, but there does seem to be something very insightful in psychoanalysis, that people can be in denial, they can be deluded, and we live in a world of just such endless advertising and marketing that's just filled with lies and over-exaggeration, and people have been lied to so constantly on all fronts. They're just lied to all the time, that maybe they've become experts at lying and lying to themselves. Everyone. And this lying to oneself, it's partly made problematic because consciousness, I guess, can operate at multiple levels where, and this is, I think, one of the real insights of Freud, that people they can repress their beliefs. They can be, I guess, hiding their true motivations from themselves as they're arguing. Just, again, very simple example would be some person's giving an argument about something, and it's not the particular content of the argument so much as how powerful they feel in adjudicating such an argument. There may be a kind of wish fulfillment of a need to feel important, to feel relevant, to feel powerful, or to be listened to and to feel valued, which is independent of any particular argument that's actually going on. I think part of the problem is to get at the contradictions, the places where it's obvious that something is going on which needs interrogation. And I think part of the strategy is, and this is what's so important about psychoanalysis, is that if at any point in an argument one wants to say to another person, look, I know you think this, but the truth is you're deluded, you're wrong, you're not seeing how you're hiding from yourself a certain truth. See, the more that one uses that strategy and points out that the other is in a false consciousness or is in a kind of denial of the truth and is hiding it or is denying it, repressing it, or is perhaps too ego attached to a counter view to see the truth, as soon as one uses that strategy, one has to be willing to entertain that other people could turn that back upon oneself and say, well, couldn't all parties involved be, I guess, as subject to that criticism? I don't know how else to say it other than I think it may be that YouTube has grown to a level of consciousness where it needs a rigorous, I guess, courageous attempt of all the parties involved to be willing to psychoanalyze themselves and the arguments therein, and to be willing to say, are people there? Are there other motives? And I guess as much as I don't want to do it, I need to give some examples. And I guess I am going to play my obvious cards here against some of the anti-natalist argument. I don't really like the argument. I'm not persuaded by it. And part of the reason I'm not persuaded by it is that the way that it denies ambiguity, the way that it hides from the fact that no single person can put life on a scale and weigh it in terms of its value for other people. Now, you can weigh it for yourself, and you can come to some serious conclusions about what you think the value of life is, and you can even advocate that and argue it for other people, but you can't push a button that makes the decision for other people without really playing God. And now, I've heard people in the anti-natalist camp, and I don't think there is this thing called the anti-natalists. I think that's a problem. And let's get to that for a second. Even some of the language strategies there. When someone says, you're either an anti-natalist or you're a natalist, and they cut the category that broad, it's such an abuse of language. I mean, it's kind of fascist in the you're either with us or you're against us. But it's a denial of the fact that there's lots of language that's already existing that makes such finer gradations that are so much more useful. That is, there's a difference between someone who's pro-life, and that's their position, they're pro-life, and someone who is an advocate of contraception, and some person who literally doesn't want to have children, maybe some person who's had a vasectomy, and some person who says, I really don't want children, but I respect the right of other people to decide to do that if they're willing to take on the responsibilities that are involved there. Okay, so when people do either you're a natalist or an anti-natalist, and then they force lots of people who use contraception or people who don't have any children into the natalist camp, it's odd. It's a kind of odd maneuver that you want to point to that and go, okay, is this a place and moment where we can see a contradiction occurring, and let's subject this to psychoanalysis? What is an ulterior motive? Well, in some way, it's a rhetorical move. It's an attempt to win an argument, but I think it's also an attempt to polarize and to make one's, I guess, opinions feel more powerful than they are. See, it has a sense of power. The same with this sense of pushing a red button. That's wanting to play God. I've heard some people say that having children is wanting to play God or playing God. No, that's a natural part of life. That all that's, everyone has ever known is life coming through other people, and that's just a natural process. The thought of a person deciding for other people whether or not life is worth living, despite the fact that it has a lot of suffering. And I don't think anyone's disputing the fact that there is suffering and it is objective. I think people are questioning whether or not one can just place that on a scale and weigh it for all other people. I think that's the critical question, right? Can you speak for others there? You can speak for yourself and for your experiences, and you can try to advocate that other people see your view. But if lots of other people, just say, for example, the whole camp of pro-lifers, if there's this whole camp of pro-lifers, and then there's this whole camp of anti-natalists, and then there's a lot of people who are either uninterested or in between, I don't think it really works to say that it's obvious to all the truth of the anti-natalist position. No, there's lots of people who are pro-lifers, and if you say, well, no, they're only deluded because they believe that there's some sort of afterlife or some sort of religious thing, and you're going to cloak it into that, I think part of the problem becomes, well, why would one have to believe that if there's no God, then all of this is unjustified? See, I've heard some people make the claim that if there's no afterlife, if there's no ultimate justice, if there's no divine recompense, then this is unjustified? I don't know where that comes from. Says who? Life has horizons of meaning, and the task is, how much can one own the responsibility of bringing meaning to one's life, to bring compassion, love to the world? To the world. I think many people who want to argue against the anti-natalist argument, they're not unsympathetic with the claims, they're not unsympathetic to some of the rough arguments. I think what they want to say is, it seems more possible, more likely, and just more factually true that you could talk people into bringing about more just world, more compassionate world, a world that I guess is the kind of world that we want to live in, than it would be to talk people out of ever having children. I think that if you're going to imagine that there is anything like agency and choice that comes from conversation and rational deliberation, then there are many people who are never going to be talked into, let's end the human project. But I think it is possible to get people to realize their own complicity in the world's injustices, and I think it is possible to really help people see that we have made progress. And I'm going to end with the progress point. In Denis Gabor, the Nobel laureate Denis Gabor, who I guess got his Nobel Prize for holography, but at any rate, in his book, The Mature Society, he talks about how in the 7 deadly sins, which are interesting, it's one of Christianity's contributions, whether Christianity is true or false, the notion of 7 deadly sins and what these habits or practices of human life are that lead to kinds of misery, and to what extent do you want to avoid these. He says what's really fascinating is that cruelty is absent from the 7 deadly sins. Yeah, cruelty is conspicuously absent, and he accounts for it by saying that pain was so inevitable throughout all of history. I mean, pain and suffering was just such a matter of fact and so inevitable, such a part of life, that they made torture a spectacle. I mean, pain, it's hard to think of a domain of experience for which we have so radically changed, at least the bulk of the modern Western world. When you think of the long, horrible history of torture and the way that people used to slaughter one another, now it still goes on today, and it's a little more quiet, but we don't make a spectacle of pain. And his argument is that when morphine was discovered, distilled out, it ended public torture. It ended because it ended the kind of spectacle of pain that had been all through history, because now it seemed cruel to inflict suffering upon people when suffering could be alleviated, when you could physically stop pain through forms of physical medicine. To deny advances in pain relief, to really deny that there has been a growth in the base level of what we call acceptable behavior. I think there's an ahistoricism. People who don't realize how different people are and how much the suffering that we experience today seems so cruel because we can imagine it not being here. Because pain relief has so advanced that we now have the capacity to imagine a world without suffering, all the suffering seems cruel. But throughout history, this wasn't the case. I mean, go look at Michel Foucault's, wonderful account of Damien the Regicide from Discipline and Punish. You'll see what most people today would vomit at, and yet people through history used to just watch that. People would be, eating food while they were watching it. At any rate, I think that YouTube is a kind of consciousness, and maybe it is time for people, everyone, to be willing to entertain the idea that what's going on the surface is very different than what's really happening. That there are ulterior motives, that, when some person says, I want to push a button because I am so certain that other people are just deluded because they're addicted to life only because they're rationalizing the time they've spent already in it. When they say that, and they're going to literally write off other people's experience on the ground that other people don't know their own experiences, but in fact could be in a false consciousness and deluded, then people have to be willing to think, how can they themselves be doing the exact same thing? How can they be suffering from a kind of false consciousness or a kind of delusion that it feels very good and powerful to hide from the ambiguity and just decide for it, decide it and resolve it. But I don't think that's really the way to go about it. I think there needs to be an ongoing discussion where people are willing to be vulnerable and humble enough to know that they might be wrong. Okay, thanks.